Welcome everyone, thanks for joining us today for the Podcasting for Journalists Masterclass. My name is Marcus Rowie and I'm an event coordinator at the Walkley Foundation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Just a bit of housekeeping, all attendees today have their video and microphones muted, so we can't see you, we can't hear you. However, if you would like to ask a question, there's a Q&A button either at the bottom or the side of your screen. So feel free to use that throughout the presentation. You can type in your questions and we'll try and get to them at the end. Due to the number of attendees, we may not get to every question, but we'll try our best. After the event, we're going to send out a really brief feedback form just to help the Walkley Foundation understand a few things about these classes, whether you'd like access to more online classes, what kind of topics you'd like to see covered. We'd love your feedback, so please do fill those out if you have a couple of minutes. Australia has a vibrant creative community that informs, inspires, and delights the nation. And in part, that's because the Copyright Agency has been standing up for creators since 1974. Copyright Agency licenses text and images to content users and ensures content creators receive fair payment for those copied works. Each year, Copyright Agency's members allocate 1.5% of the company's income to a wide variety of projects assisting writers, artists, publishers, and the Australian cultural community through the Cultural Fund. We would like to thank the Copyright Agency for their support of this event. And now to introduce our host. Helen Pitt is a Sydney Morning Herald journalist who has worked as a senior writer, the opinion and letters editor at this newspaper, where she began her career in 1986. She has worked as a feature writer for The Bulletin magazine in California, for New York Times Digital, and as a television reporter at Euronews in France. In 1992, she was selected to take part in the Journalists in Europe program in Paris. Her feature writing has won the Oscar Media Award and been highly commended in the UN Media Peace Prize. Her book, The House, Allen and Unwin, won the 2018 Walkley Book Award. Now, in just a moment, I'll throw it over to Helen to begin the presentation. Won't be a minute.
Thanks for joining me, and I also have a little bit of housekeeping. This is a session on book length journalism, narrative or creative nonfiction, as it's sometimes called. It's not a how to write fiction session. I've never written a novel, nor is it about memoir. The tips I'm giving today are aimed mainly at journalists who want to do longer form true story. So I say this because some of you hinted that you might be interested in doing a little bit of fiction, but sorry, I can't really help you there. I asked all of you what you wanted to get out of this session, so I've tried to answer a lot of those questions, or as many as I can. And if they're not answered, sorry, there's some lovely old pictures from the Herald archive of the Sydney Opera House. So consider this a sort of paint by numbers, if you like, approach to building a book, just like the building of the Sydney Opera House. So I'm going to break it down into several stages as they did. All I know is based on my own experience of writing this book, The House. So let's start with, how do you start? Well, the most important thing is, what is your idea? And I want you to think of your idea the way you think of a spouse. Now, alas, Brad Pitt is not my spouse, even though we share a surname. But ask yourself, can you wake up with this idea every day? Wake up beside it like you would a spouse. It will be the first thing that will occupy your thoughts in the morning. So you have to think of your idea as a passion project. So like with any affair of the heart, beware, you won't always love it. In fact, I can assure you, you will probably hate it at some points. You will certainly resent it and the amount of time it takes for you and takes you away from your friends and family. So I'm just warning you at the very beginning, sometimes ideas are about people that are not very palatable at all too. So that's another thing. You've got to be either working on behalf of the victim and working really hard about why you want to tell this story. You need to be compelled to tell it and committed to complete it. So what makes a good book idea? Well, for me, the idea for my book came to me while I was driving across the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, where I was living in 2008. And I heard on the radio that the Sydney Opera House architect, Jorn Utzon, had died. And I felt this instant stab in my heart and was transported immediately back to this. October 20, 1973, the day the Sydney Opera House opened. I'm not one of those girls, but I was an 8-year-old on the harbour on the day that the Opera House opened, the day the Queen cut those ribbons that you can see in the background there. And it's almost as if I could smell and feel and taste that day still. It was kind of like the first story I ever reported on as an 8-year-old, because it was the first really big thing that happened in my life in Sydney. So I remember it as a spectacle. And as I was driving across the Golden Gate Bridge that day in 2008, listening to Utsen's obit being read on the BBC, I thought, that is a great story. The Danish designer who built this World Heritage listed building that has put Sydney on the international stage died before seeing it complete. So that was kind of my elevator pitch, if you like it. That's what you call it in America, the kernel of the story, the nut graph also, as they call it in American journalism. So a month after Utsen's death, I wrote to my old boss at the Bulletin, Richard Walsh, who was then and is now the consultant publisher at Allen & Unwin Publishing House, and suggested a narrative nonfiction book for a younger audience on the Utsen story. So a helpful way for you to do your own nut graph or your own elevator pitch is to write a pretend back cover blurb for the book. It's really helpful to be able to sum it up in a couple of sentences at the very most. So I would really suggest you do that. So now every book needs a narrative arc, very much like that piece of plywood you can see in this picture. It was the plywood that adorned the streets of Sydney with the royal insignia the day that Queen Elizabeth II came to Australia for the first time in 1954. Now, I didn't know at the time I found this photo, you can see it's completely a real photo, it's been folded and kept in the archive, that the person that created that plywood would be a major character in my book. But all I kept thinking of as the metaphor for that narrative arc, that you need a beginning, a middle, and an end. The first act, the second act, and the third act. So you've got to have drama and tension mounting and a resolution, a gentle pacing. It's sort of like telling a joke. There are narrative elements which are actually real storytelling. It's not a he said, she said like you do in journalism, no inverted pyramid. Don't be confined by the straitjacket of journalism when you do it. So how do you pitch a book proposal? So before you do it, do your research would be my suggestion. Look at the market for this type of book that you're really interested in doing and see what your competitors are. Which publishers do your type of book well? A visit to the bookshop is really the best thing. You will find out there, if you look in the acknowledgements, who are the sort of people in the publishing houses that you're interested in. Perhaps the agents, perhaps the publishers will be mentioned. So authors usually do this. So if you can't work that out, submit it to a publishing house. But the good idea is to know who your target audience is going to be, to who you're sending your pitch to. So how do you convince the powers that be that your idea is better than what already exists? And I use this slide here because this is an example of what was at Bennelong Point. It's the Fort Macquarie tram depot. So it was up to the Sydney burghers at the time who gave the green light to have that detonated and got rid of. But they had to convince that Sydney-siders that they had a better idea for what would go there. So don't be put off by competitors that may be doing the same sort of story as you. I went to the Mitchell Library as I was starting my book and just did a quick search of titles, and I found 279 books with the word Sydney Opera House in the title. So I was a little overwhelmed, I've got to say. So all I can say is don't be deterred. It's not just the idea, but the way you're going to execute it that makes your book special. So should you get an agent? I think that is probably a pretty good idea. Most journalists are more than capable of negotiating a contract. However, having an agent can be really advantageous in terms of getting better terms and the book, getting to the best publisher, all that sort of thing. And then if you're running late or you don't like the cover or anything like that, they can advocate on your behalf, just as if you're a journalist, your news editor advocates on your behalf in news conference for your story. So that's that's perhaps a way to look at the benefits. You've got to remember they're protection for you, but they will take a share of your royalties. So you really need to think about whether or not you want that. Do your research. And again, when you're talking to them, think about really specifically who are your characters in the book. So in my case, you can see I had Eugene Goossens, who was involved in one of the most colourful pornographic scandals in Australia, who was the ideas man behind the Sydney Opera House, and the guy on the right was the political man, Joe Carl. And I didn't know that they were really great characters when I started writing. I just thought I was writing a book about Jorn Utzon, frankly, but I didn't know I had these great characters. So nut them out too. You'll only get one shot at your proposal. So really make sure it's good, and maybe break it really down into sort of Jungian archetypes like heroes and villains. This is what I thought my book was going to be about. I thought I had Jorn Utzon, the guy on the left, the young Danish dashing architect, and then the villain of sorts, who is the guy on the right, William Davis Hughes, who's talking to John Coburn, the creator of the curtain that you'll see, this curtain of the sun that will keep coming back into this slide on and off. They were the people that I thought that the book was going to be about. Again, you can break it down into very sort of simple heroes and villains in a very basic proposal, but I think this is a really good idea to do. So don't jump the gun like Eugene Goossens did and present this as a fait accompli. This was his idea for the Sydney Opera House. You can see he's got a little outdoor Hollywood Bowl style thing, outdoor symphony space there too, and his P&O windows that he really loved. So don't be put off by that at all. Just my original proposal contained only 12 chapters in my book. It ended up being about 30. You can see sort of how thick the book is. So don't jump the gun. Don't be worried too much if it's not exactly what you thought it was going to be at the end. Just give it a go and give it and start. So the next question is, of course, where do I start? Now that can be a little overwhelming. A blank page is the best answer to that. Now I use this picture because it's by one of my favourite artists. Many of you might know the illustrator Michael Fitzjames, and he always starts the page with a blank page, and all those beautiful lines and the detail that you can see in that picture. So it can be really overwhelming. My best advice to you is to just start and sit down and do what I call, what the US author actually calls, Anne Lamott, a shitty first draft. Now they are, as you see, on the left, my first draft, in the middle, my second draft, and then the third box, it's the galleys of the book. So yes, it's good old-fashioned paper, and I would suggest that you work on paper when you're editing stuff for a long form piece, because you'll see lots of themes. You might need to move chapters, you might need to move ideas around or see a theme. Printing out is pretty much, it's not helpful for all the world's trees, alas, but that is the most important thing, is to get that shitty first draft down. And the secret to writing is not the writing, but it's the rewriting. So how do I get organised? Well, I used what my friend Robert Wainwright, who is an author that might be watching today in Britain, I use his technique because he suggested to me, ask your friends, how do you get organised? Well, he suggested setting up a whole load of electronic files chronologically. So the year, you know, from 1944 to 1974 was what I had set up. And I put my research into each of those electronic files. So that's really helpful advice. The other way is, like, I had all these old Herald clippings files that were color coded, and I would be absolutely dogged about putting them back each day, because if you lose a piece of paper that you're going to be needing, and trust me, you'll go through so many when you're doing a real story that's got a lot of research back to it, you need to put them back. So that's what my files were. They were the old Herald clippings files. That was my point of difference, because despite the fact there'd been 279 other books, not all of them had used the Herald clippings files. I also had personality files, which you can see kept of a lot of dead people that I would cross-reference to. And then I would put them once I had typed up my chapters, I would keep them in folders like this. And I also did a lot of transcription of my interviews immediately. I actually outsourced that. I got someone else to do the typing. As you know now, there are all these great electronic transcription services called Otter, and they can completely do all that work, that hard work for you. So it's completely like the best thing to keep, to make sure that you've got another transcription service that will do all these hard things for you. So don't be worried if you get put off. Just remember, a friend of mine has always said that procrastination is your best friend. And yes, I can't say that, I can't encourage that more. If you heard the other day, Jennifer Saunders was talking on ABC Radio, talking about what a bad procrastinator she is. She said, I wish it was a diagnosable mental illness, because then there would be somewhere I could go to get it treated. She also talked about, she was approached by Ruby Wax to do a film script with Goldie Hawn, and Ruby says, oh, Jennifer, we'll get it done in a week. Well, it took them 3 years, and then it's actually never even happened. So I found this really an encouraging story, because you will procrastinate and you will, it's all part of the process. Honestly, sometimes you're struggling to write 250 words a day. Other days, 2,000 come out of you without even it being an effort. So don't worry about that. Go off and have a shower or a walk, and you'll be amazed at how often that the problem you're having will get resolved. So, great works take a long time sometimes. And I just wanted to show the man, Eero Saarinen, who was the judge that pretty much advocated Jorn Utsen's piece on behalf of everyone. This is him working with the Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri Gateway Arch. That's his model. But you see up on the left-hand corner, he's looked at all these arches throughout the world as a way to reference his work. So don't be afraid to read. The way to become a good writer is to read a lot. So, and don't be worried about it being similar to other things that your book being similar to other things that you've read. So this was the work, the TWA airport, that the TWA in JFK airport that he was working on at the time. We can see like a winged bird of flight. So you can see why it's quite similar to the actual idea they chose, which was Jorn Utsen's. This was on his original submission. You can see the sort of the wings and the dreamy jet age kind of concepts. So, they were quite similar, but the bold idea actually stood out from all the others, because this is how the Opera House could have looked, those various other options that we had there. But you can see even in that, the US and the UK submissions, they weren't mind-blowing, but that kind of really stands out. And your idea, if it's good and it's well executed, will really stand out. So don't be afraid to put your absolute best effort into it. How do you structure the book? Well, take heart from Jorn Utsen, who had no clue when he started building the Sydney Opera House about how to do it. That would be my best advice. You're not going to know until you start. So again, just sit down and get that shitty first draft off and going and playing around with all the words that you have before you. So just remember that this is a narrative, right? And so a narrative has a narrator. So listen to your words, read them aloud to someone else. And if you don't have that option, record it and play it back. But just remember, this has got to sound like a story. Sometimes you get a bit caught up as a journalist sticking very much to what someone said. Well, in narration, you can take what they said and make it better, or make it your own, give it your own mark. So this is where a lot of radio and TV journalists have a great advantage over the print people, because they're used to the sing-song nature of listening to the language. So that is really a helpful tool to listen to the words and how they all come together, so that you can tell your story as if it is someone telling you the story or you're being told to. So you do have to, probably it's a good idea to start with a blueprint or a bit of a plan. But I mean, it's a bit like anyone that's had a baby. You start with a birth plan and you throw that completely out the window. Like, as I said, I started with 12 chapters and I ended up with 30 something. So don't worry about that. But definitely have mapped it out as if you know where you're going. But the really important thing to remember is it's just really hard manual labor. Like you can see, that is plywood on the left-hand side that people are working on. It's nails and hard manual labor. They're putting together the segments for the opera house there. And then the picture on the right is the inside of the concert hall, where you can see it sort of looked like an upended Viking ship at the time. And that's what Utzon was claiming it was sort of based on. So it is bum on the seat labor, and don't be frightened about the fact, or you maybe will be a little frightened about the fact that your bum will probably get bigger and the seat will get smaller, because that is the only way you are going to get this thing accomplished. It's bum on the seat hard work. However, don't be put off by it. I think it's worth it. I found in the course of my research this wonderful old man called Joe Batoni. You can see him in the bottom left-hand corner. It took me 5 people to get to him, but when I did, he was this wonderful character. He only died last year at 97, and there he is at my book launch talking to Louise Heron. And there he is in 1963 creating this thing called the erection arch. Now, it was a movable truss that allowed all the segments to be put together of the Sydney Opera House. So I always took him as a great example of someone whose story could have been completely different. He was a concentration camp survivor. He escaped 2 concentration camps. He was a Corsican spy in the Second World War. And then when he came to Australia in the 50s, he worked all over the place, was working in a bridge building company in Brisbane that ended up getting him the work in Sydney. And he said, it was the most important job of my life. And he was so proud of it. So that's what I would say. You know, convict yourself to something and get the job done. But also remember that like the movable truss, the frame has to move with your goals. So this picture I love because you can see his movable truss in operation, and you can see the segments of the opera house. The important thing to remember about books is it looks seamless, doesn't it? You just pick up this book, but actually there's lots of little broken down chapters in it, just like there are segments in the opera house. So break it down into movable bite-sized chunks. This guy ended up being the villain in my story. And you can see William Davis Hughes, he's again got the plywood. He keeps coming back to the plywood, which ends up being one of the major points of problem with him in Utzon. And above is the plywood palace on Parramatta River. I use this because, again, it's showing a bit of structure to the actual building. And I also think you've got to be prepared to just throw out that idea and start all over again sometimes. So, which is indeed what happened with the Opera House. So don't be afraid to stray from the original structure. Now, this, believe it or not, is the Dubbo Civic Centre. And you can see the curve of the roof. It's called a Sisu roof. And it's the plywood, again, that this man, Ralph Simmons, had wanted to provide for the Sydney Opera House, which the point ended up being the point of conflict and the point of tension. And this is what I'm getting to with all the plywood talk, is that the plywood ended up being the big, like, mother of all tensions between these two men. So I thought I had to sort of understand a bit about the plywood. So here is this thing called a Sisu roof. Now, a Sisu roof, Sisu is a Finnish word, and that means to pull out of yourself something you didn't think possible, a sort of a ridiculous request. And ironically, I ended up finding this word Sisu throughout all of Utzon's files. This is the Sisu roof in the Bergsved Church in Copenhagen that is said to resemble his ideas for what the interior of the opera house would have looked like if he stayed on in the project. And it ended up being such a great metaphor for me, because every time when I was getting near the end thinking, oh God, I just can't complete this, is taking so much time, I think of this Sisu word that he used. He used it as the holding company that bought the land for his home. It was the name of his boat. It was everywhere in the Utzon story. So I use that roof thing as a bit of a metaphor for what you're going to be requiring of yourself. So I asked myself, is it worth it? You know, and I think he would have asked himself this. Here he is, surrounded by reporters on the day that he supposedly got kicked out or resigned, however you want to take it. I don't know is the answer, because is a book worth it? Is a major project like this? It's up to you to make that decision. Like, he never really made any money from this project. In fact, it bankrupted him. It has given the world this building, which to Australia is worth, has a total social asset value of $6.2 billion, estimated by Deloitte. It's a brand more recognisable than Australia. I mean, what would we be without the Sydney Opera House? Like, we're not a recognisable city, that's for sure. So I think he must ask himself that a lot. And I want you to think about this yourself too before you embark on it, because the truth is, most book advances in Australia are going to be in the vicinity of $15,000 to $25,000, and sometimes they don't even earn out that amount. That means you may not earn more than that. So I think you need to bear that in mind. Unless your book sells really well and then you get money on top of the advance, that's great. But just ask yourself, is it worth it? And only you can answer that one. So this also, another really important thing is take a break sometimes, because it's a big project. It's not like writing a 400 or 500 word news story. I want you to take a look at, this is the slide that was taken on the day that Jornutsen left Australia in 1966. So you can see it was half complete, and it took another 2 years before work recommenced. I would really suggest you do that yourself. So, set yourself a cracking deadline. At one point, I was trying to do a chapter a week, which was ridiculous. That was a lot of work because I was working part-time at the same time. But set your own goals and deadlines that make it, absolutely necessary. But don't be afraid to take a break, because one of the most important things I did do was take a break, and I went to Denmark to do some more research. But I also walked the Camino in France, and in that, I discovered at the end of the Camino, I picked up this book that was written by Michael Connelly. And in it, he's a crime writer. Read extensively. Other things that are not like what you're writing would be what I'd suggest to. And he said he writes every chapter as if it is a movie scene. So I came home and I rewrote the whole book that way, as if I was telling the story and like it was a movie scene. And this was the only model that that Jornutsen left that I found in Denmark. There are only 4 in the world. So I was so excited to find this. And you can see again, that Sisu roof in the middle. And I thought it just gave me the actual strength I needed to keep going to complete this story. So it actually was a great thing to take a break and get a bit inspired. And if you don't finish it, your idea, somebody else is going to have to do it for you. And in this case, this was Peter Hall, this unhappy task, the Australian that ended up having to complete the Sydney Opera House. And, it ended up breaking him. He ended up becoming, alcoholic and on the street and bankrupt. And again, I mean, in the same way that Utzon did too, but I've asked his family, would he have not done that? And they said, oh, he wouldn't have missed it for the world. It was the highlight of his career. And I'd have to say, I feel the same way. You can be a journalist all your life, but to actually complete something like a book, it gives you such a sense of accomplishment that you can't put a dollar term on it. So that's the other thing. You do this thing not for the money, just because you really love it. Also be prepared for the fate of John Coburn. As you see, this is his completed Curtain of the Sun, which I absolutely love. And as a kid, as an 8-year-old going into the Opera House, it's the thing I remember the most. And actually, you can see it's the cover of my diary too. I just love anything that is bold and colourful and says the 70s like this tapestry did. Well, the real tragedy of this is it was actually put in storage in mothballs in 1974, the year after it opened. And it's barely been on site ever since. It was on display one day last year for one day only. But be prepared that you book all this effort you might put into, it might end up in the remainder table. It probably will, actually, or worst of all fates, be sent to your colleagues at the Sydney Morning Herald, and they don't even, you can't even give it away. So again, you've got to do this because you want to do it. You might be lucky enough to get a film deal out of it or something as a result, but don't expect too much of the idea. And then when you've completed it, do not be backward at all about telling everyone that you've completed it. So use every opportunity to plug the book. As you can see, I've done with Dame Medney here. If you've got a regular radio slot, or you've done a TED talk, or you've had previously published books, or you've won a Walkley for something or other, make sure that everyone knows everything about your personal talents, and as a way to publicize it. Don't just let your publishing house know, but the publicist will need to know too. So you've got to cover off every publicity angle you can think of. Like if you've written a rural romance and you happen to come from the country and you met your husband at a B&S, that's perfect. You've got to think of themes that help you sell your book. So there's a lot more to it than you actually think than well, you've written the book and then you've got to get it in people's minds. So that's another way to sort of really just plug every contact you've ever got. So do you still want to do this? Before I did this session, I asked for your ideas, and every one of them I read had merit. They sounded great. Those who didn't want to share with me, that is fine. Just do what I'd suggest Joyce Carol Oates, the author, does in her 10 writing tips. She says she's got these 10 tips. You can Google them and find out. But number 1 is write your heart out. And number 10 is write your heart out. So only you can decide if you want to do that, what's in your heart. If you do want to write this story, you go ahead and do it. The thing I always come back to is I remember a Christmas party at the Sydney Morning Herald a couple of years ago. A line from one of the spoof songs was, "Conviction is all you need. You might win a Walkley or jail an Obeid," and Kate McClymont's the response to her book. So, and her many stories. So think about all of that. It may not be a dollar signs that come in your fortune or in your future, but if a book is in your heart, show it to the world. All right, I think we're going to move over to you for some questions. So, is there a template for electronic chronological files? Alas, no. There could be. I don't know. I certainly didn't have one. I just did the old-fashioned Microsoft Word, create new folder, and I just did it electronically. There probably is. There's no doubt. Like for people that are doing plays, Final Draft is a wonderful tool to use. So there could be, but I'm pretty old school when it comes to, I have the folder in my documents and desktop file, and I used the same computer that I've used, for years. So it was just an easy way to come and go. So there could be a way for finding a template, but I haven't found it. How do you write a book without a due date like you have in your journalism work? This is a concern for me. Yes, Carol. Sorry, that first question is from Juno. This is from Carol Goldsmith. It is very hard. I dropped to part-time work. I wouldn't suggest that necessarily. I would say that you are going to have to find time to do it. I mean, if you can afford to do it, that's great. Working part-time on a book and work meant you're working full-time, but I don't think I'd do that again, because you really need big uninterrupted hunks of time. It'd be my best solution my suggestion about when you're doing big jobs. So if you can, either do it at night. Like, for example, I read that Joyce Carol Oates does 8-to-1 hand writes, and I found often when I couldn't find my voice, which happens a lot sometimes, if I hand wrote it, it came out much more easily. So she hand writes in the morning and she types up at night. So you might have to do it before and after work. So you finding the time is, again, it's up to you. If you're convicted to do it, you will find time to do it. Do you think it's better, Adam Courtney, to do most of the research first and write later? Well, yeah, I would. That's my method. It doesn't always work. As I said, when I went off to Denmark, when I took my break and I found all this great stuff, I went there twice. I had to reorder it and put it in at the last minute. And I mean, it's very tricky to do it that way. But you do you work with what you've got, don't you? Like if you can do the research first, great. But if you say can't get, at the moment, it would be very hard to get to a primary source sometimes, I imagine. So you'd be working with what you've got because of COVID. So you can leave hunks of space and come back to it. It's not ideal, but I mean, my method is try and do as much research first as you can, but it doesn't always work that way. Nicholas McCallum, how do you work with and maintain the pace of the narrative and the pace of doing the work itself? It is a very good question, Nicholas. The pace of the narrative would be, again, go and read some good crime fiction would be my suggestion. Take a break, and there's some great proponents of this work. Jane Harper, The Dry, all of Chris Hammer's books, because he's a journalist that's become a fiction writer. You will get the pacing from any kind of book that you like to read. And you're right, it does need to be subtle. It needs to be sped up, but it needs to be slowed down too. So again, just go back and read books, ones that you like, and model it on that. Would be my suggestion. Rick Waugh. Is it important to have an audience in mind, and how does that affect the form of your writing? I think every writer has an audience in mind when they start writing. It's a bit harder with a book. For example, when I write a story for the Sydney Morning Herald readers, I kind of know what they are interested in because I've been reading the paper for a lot longer than I've been working for it. So I kind of know my audience there. When it comes to writing a book, I guess I was writing it for people like Sydney-siders, my parents, the people that, showed me my city. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people find it really helpful to be writing for one specific person. I don't necessarily. I just try and know who I'm working for. For example, I knew the story of the Sydney Opera House was really a very Sydney-centric Australian story. Not necessarily, the book I've written is not necessarily of interest to people outside of Australia unless they know it or grew up here. So yeah, I guess it's good to have a target market sort of in mind, but I don't necessarily have them in mind when I write, would be my answer to that. What are 1 to 2 examples of mistakes that journos make when writing long form? Something that they should be careful about? Well, that's a very good question. And my suggestion to that, my answer to that would be they treat it too much like a 300 to 400 word news story, in that they have no dramatic tension and there's no narration. So it's just a he said, she said, the leads at the top, and that is, you got to throw that all out of the door. You really have to rethink a book, look at books and look how they do it. Like, you can use that model in some shape or form, but you can't put all the important information in the first paragraph like you do with journalism, because you actually want your reader to keep reading. We're talking 70 to 100,000 words. It's not 70 to 100 words. So you really have to pace it out. So the most common mistake I can tell you is just treating it like a news story. So again, I'm not pointing the finger here. I'm guilty of this too. As I said, the first draft of my book was like interesting journalism, would be what I'd say. It had no characters. It had no life. And I get it now from rereading it. So my suggestion to you would be to go and get some non-fiction books. Like on that final slide I had up, there's a couple of books I suggested. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, who's the one that talks about the shitty first draft. On Writing by Stephen King, ripper writer. You couldn't go wrong with his suggestions. Another great American author is William Zinsser, which is On Writing Well. And so they are about writing. It's not about journalism. They're really good books. And to develop a daily discipline, another great thing out of California is a thing called the Artist's Way, which makes you write 3 pages a day. And I think in that you get out of your journalism head and start writing through your fingertips again. And another great craft tip is The Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White. So they are good books that I would suggest that you go back and have a look at. What sources of funding are available in Australia to support this type of writing? Are newspapers, Griffith Review, public institutions, museum galleries interested and have any funding of working on a relevant issue? Well, interestingly, the New South Wales State Library does have some scholarships that are worth looking into. Not newspapers, alas, no. The Copyright Agency does have some grants. We're doing this thanks to them. They're not huge, but there's certainly places that if you're looking for grant money, Australia Council has it too, but certainly the state libraries are the ones that I would suggest going to. And then if you don't get grant money up front, they do have very good prizes, which are prize money. So if you're working on a book and you submit it, that can be really helpful in terms of the money that it gets to give you the next book. But yeah, alas, it's not a great time to be a writer. And as I suggested, the publishing houses are pretty strapped at the moment. So the largest advance you'd get as a sort of a first-time author would be in that 15 to 25,000, and that's on the good side. Most of them are below that. So, you know, yeah, it's not, as I said, a money-making venture. If your book does not recoup the advance, do you have to pay the balance back to the publisher? Yes, good question. Not usually is the answer. Don't tell them that I told you that. I did. I earn out my advance, and so I am now getting. I'm now getting 6 monthly royalty checks, which is lovely. So you know, they factored it in how many that advance they give you. If it doesn't sell, because every book is a risk, you know, so these are hard and fast businessmen and women that are in the publishing houses. So they have factored in the fact that you mightn't complete it and it mightn't sell. So, no, you don't have to pay it back, but you probably will never get the option of writing something again. So, because it's a small industry and the word would get around, and so I wouldn't suggest that at all. How much creative license did you give yourself in interpreting or rewriting what people had told you? Well, none. Creative license in the way I told it, yes, but I mean, everything was true. I did the whole kind of, as I would do in my journalism, I had several piles of good old-fashioned notebooks, or else in my recorded, transcribed interviews, I went through it very methodically. So, like, yes, creative license in the way you tell their story, but it's still the truth. So you still you can set up the template and put the truth in. Sometimes you have to imagine what it would be like for someone, but usually even when I did that, like for Jornuksen, I asked his family. So you can't always guess what someone's thinking, but you can ask enough people to be able to, you know, create the mood and scene. Aren't there enough books in the world already? Do you have to be an egoist to think that you have something interesting to say for others to pay them and read them? I don't know. Do you? I just think that there's some really good stories worthy of telling, and you know, it could be something like Louise Milligan telling the Cardinal George Pell story of his victims. They're really important things. There's a lot of really important journalism that becomes books. So I think there's always space for a book that is going to illuminate and going to tell us more about something that we might be puzzled about. How can you sell a book in Australia when the primary story is in France? How do you sell to another market country? Well, that is a very good question. You would be best to maybe try any of your contacts in that other market or country, or else when you do find a local publisher, talk about international rights. You would be best getting an agent, would be my suggestion. If your story is in France, I would suggest someone like Jeanne Rickmans, who's lived there and has brought to the world some really wonderful books. The two recent ones I can think of are Paul Burns's story of underage Anzacs, which was set partly, it's a true story of young Anzac soldiers who died on the First World Battlefront. So I would suggest her. And the other one was The Erratics by Vicky Levroux Harvey, who they actually met in France. So do your research, find agents that will look to publishing your book somewhere else, and she'd be one that I suggest. Do you think there's an appetite in Australian audiences for book-length journalism that is written from overseas? Yes. In this case, Mexico. That would make a connection between Australia and Mexico in its themes reporting. Yes, definitely. Because is there another book like that? I don't think there is. And I know you've written for the opinion page occasionally. I think you really should look at what there is. There was a wonderful Mexican journalist that came to Sydney Writers Festival last year, whose name completely escapes me. Check out her books and check out if this is a crime related story, check out what's already on the market. And I mean, I definitely think no one's made that. That's actually a good selling point. No one's made that connection as yet, I think. I'm not really sure. Again, do your research and check it out. What are the transcription services you used? I used a man in Serbia who did them overnight that another friend had suggested I use, but I would not, no need to do that now. The transcription service you can use these days is called Otter. It's an app you can, there are others, there are many others. The one I use for my journalism is called Otter. I would highly recommend it. Sometimes I don't get the words immediately correct, but you can kind of guess what it is. So you have an app on your phone and you get your person to talk into it very clearly. It saves such a huge amount of time typing up. I love it because you're after the most efficient use of your time, and transcribing is a painful but necessary part of any sort of long form journalism. So I would suggest transcription services. I know Annabelle, that's it. I interviewed her for The Guardian. Thank you. Couldn't remember her name. She was wonderful, really wonderful. Build on that, build on Annabelle, the Mexican journalist, and that's a really great idea. If you're exploring a topic, how do you find a narrative arc and characters? Yeah, Caitlin, it's a very good question. You have to get down to the nuts and bolts of your characters would be my best suggestion there. So think of the arc kind of like a bridge, and you have a character like a pillar. A character is a pillar holding up the arc would be my best description. So dig really deeply on each of those characters, because they can be really surprising and interesting, and you won't know that until you do your research on them. So really dig down on getting as much information about the character and throwing it all away, but just so you know that about them. And then, like, it's like plays, you've got to give a bit of exposition of the character in your story. So you can just pepper your story with a bit of their background as you go. What about self-publishing? Would you recommend it? Also, how do you promote your book if you self-publish? Well, I thought it sounded great, actually. I have a friend called Wendy Frew who did a book called Lean Times, which was about her family background. She wouldn't necessarily recommend it because you're paying for it up front. You're paying for it to get published. But she's found a very supportive bookstore in Adelaide that stocks it, that's where her family are from. So if you're really finding it impossible to get published, I would go down the self-publishing route, because that's exactly what Vicky Lavreux Harvey did. She did self-publish this wonderful book called The Erratics, which won the Stella Prize last year. But when she found an agent, which was Jean, she then got a good publisher on hands, but she already had like maybe 1,000 copies. So it's the second line of advance, I would say, after you've tried mainstream publishing, because, as I said, you're not even going to make that much money with mainstream publishing, but self-publishing, you will be paying up front. So still, if you want your story to be told, usually the benefit of big publishing houses is their in-house editors, who are really terrific at helping you structure the story and knowing how to sell it. So there are some pluses and minuses with both. I would say the traditional publishing house is the best way to go. But, if you don't, nothing wrong with self-publishing and then pitching it to an agent to get published in a big house. Apart from books, what magazines, long-form magazines, literary magazines, websites do you recommend to read regularly? Well, you're already favourites is New Yorker, Granta, and they have fabulous places to start. The Neiman Narrative Journalism site is excellent. So too is The Atlantic. I love reading The Atlantic. There are fewer and fewer places in Australia, obviously, because they are, not as, we don't have the big sort of circulation like they had in England. I mean, I know it's a bit bland sometimes, but I love The Economist because it's got really short, sharp, great narratives, but an easy read on things. So, I mean, and your standard, your Vanity Fairs and your Esquires and all that sort of stuff. But, and even The Good Weekend has some lovely narrative journalism still. So, locally, you're already on the right ones, though. New Yorker, Granta are great places to start. I have an idea and an outline, an agent and a publisher interested in reading sample chapters, but I feel stumped now that I have to write sample chapters. The pandemic has kept me pretty busy, but that's changing now and I really need to get this done. Yep. Bum on seat would be all I would suggest. Just get that shitty first draft down and to them, and be open to what they might suggest. Certainly the agent and the publisher, because the in-house editor will be just looking at the actual idea and the restructuring of it. That's all possible to do, as an editor yourself, that you got the basics for a story. It just might need some repurposing would be my best description of that. I understand how you can find narrative arc and characters when you've done all the research, but I don't quite understand how you do that for sample chapters. Yeah, okay, well, it's the same thing. You're at the baby steps stage, I guess, when you're doing sample chapters, but really you'd be doing your first chapter, or what you think is your first chapter, so that the whiz bang, the really important part of your book that you want people to be reading. So I wouldn't worry about that too much, and I would have thought they'd only want one sample chapter, but it's a discussion to have with the agent, I would say. But if you've got people already interested, I wouldn't waste time with, agonizing about it too much. Just get it in. I missed the beginning. Is this webinar being recorded? Aren't you very lucky, Melissa Holmes? Because yes, it is. So you'll be able to find out where that will be. Marcus will be telling us later where that is. And I think that might be all the questions. Have I covered them? Oh, there's a couple from Suzette Mead. When you are researching, interviewing, did you find resistance to people wanting to talk to you when you said you were writing a book? No. Answer. Oh, no, that's not true. A little bit from the Utzon family and a little bit from the Hall family. But usually once because it was bringing up stuff that they wanted buried in the past, because I found some wonderful old letters that were in the Utzon archive, like a decade after he died. It was very hard for them to bring up some of that stuff, and certainly is mainly dealing with the family. So what I did was I tried to be as sensitive as possible. I ran everything by the families. I in fact drove down to the Hall's family in the Southern Highlands and read it to them like, a bedtime story. And I was very touched because they were in tears. So that meant I felt that I had their permission to tell this story. With the Utzons, it was the same. There's a lot of toing and froing, but you do find resistance, but usually people, like with journalism or like doing the dreaded death knock, it's just an awful thing to have to go and talk to someone after a loved one has died. But usually I've always found that people want to talk, and as someone who has lost a significant number of people in my life, I think it's permission. And if you're doing it politely, I love the opportunity to be able to talk after, either someone's died or so. The initial resistance is something you will come up to. You should do it very sensitively. Lauren Novak, at what point in the process should you pitch to a publisher? How much do you have to have done before that point? Well, again, that is a tricky question. Like for me, I just pitched the idea and I got lucky. I did the proper outline when I got very serious and did do a sample chapter, which I must add, ended up not being used at all in the book because I was in the early days and I didn't really know what I was doing. So I would say talk to an agent or pitch to a publisher, put the outline of the idea. Sometimes you don't even need to do the sample chapter. They'll be just so sold on the idea. So it depends what you do. Like novelists, a lot of first-time novelists write the entire book before they pitch to an agent or a publisher. So it's completely up to you. But if you're a journalist and you're time poor and you really want a commitment from a publishing house, I would say before you start doing something. So I would say at the very beginning, if you're a journalist, maybe you're not, maybe you're writing the great Australian novel, in which case just go for your life and, do it and submit it afterwards. Very few Australian agents accept new book proposals, and publishers apparently don't even read most of what is submitted in their slush pile. That's true. So how does an author get a great idea in front of a publisher if they don't already have strong contacts in the publishing industry? Read the acknowledgements part of the books and find an agent, or just go online, do a lot of research online. There are some terrific agents out there, and some of them will do, a lot of them in fact, will do editing work to get your book into a space that's they feel good enough to be able to be submitted to a publishing house. So just do your research. And, the copyright agency is a great place to start to get some of those contacts. If you're exploring a topic that may change, say an area of scientific research, how do you stop feeling like you need to hold off for fear of new research developments and your book becoming outdated? before it's even published. This is a huge problem for medical stories, of course, because a book is so much intense labor that by the time it's published anyway, it might be completely all out of date. So again, I would say stick to the very specific scientific and medical publications, book publishers, before you start, because it's really something to take into account. And there are specific agents that do just medical and scientific stories. So that I completely understand that one, Lydia. It's a tricky subject, and I wouldn't hold off as much as you can, because by the time, the timeline of a book is very long. I submitted my final draft at the beginning of the year, but it takes another 6 or 7 or 8 months before it's going to be published. And there's just legal things that need to happen as well as the writing. So yeah, it's a long time. And maybe a book is not the thing you should be doing. Maybe it's a podcast. Maybe it's a series of articles, because a book with scientific research is very hard. It's very easy to get gazumped by the new research. Did I already have a strong following on social media? I've heard, yeah, okay, so I've heard publishers look at this. Lynette Hoffman asks, yes, because that's what's known as your platform. And I did have a strong following on social media thanks to my job at the Sydney Morning Herald, but I honestly do not think that that's what helped sell my book. I think radio and TV is what sells books, and getting out and plugging it. So yes, you can get people, because I mean, the social media people they're great retweeters. They don't necessarily buy books. It's big time radio, daily radio that sells books. You can see that on Booktopia. You'll see when someone will say, I bought this, I heard her on radio, I heard her do this. The publishing houses say that books fall off the shelf the moment they're on Richard Fidler's Conversation Hour. So you can't actually aim for that. Of course, your agent or yourself can try, but you've got to have a book and a story that's good enough to tell. So you've got to be able to, again, get your elevator pitch in an understandable enough form for it to be sold on radio. So yeah, social media is not the thing that sells books, but it's helpful in terms of your platform. What was the name of the book that Wendy self-published before finding a publisher in Adelaide? It was called Lean Times, Leane Times, by Wendy Fruit. I think we're out of questions. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry if I haven't got to them all yet. I'm going to hand back now to Marcus, and we would like you, both of us, like to thank the Copyright Agency for being so helpful in getting these Walkley talks off the road. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Helen. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And thanks again to the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund for their support of this event. As mentioned, we have recorded it and we will be making these recordings available, so keep an eye out for that. I'll also be sending around that quick feedback form. It just takes a couple of minutes. We'd appreciate it if you could fill it out. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And Helen has been nice enough to put together a short one-pager summarizing some of the content from today with some tips. So thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.